is going to be very kind of relaxed, probably verging on shambolic. So, what I wanted to do was just to say a few words about a poetry residency which I did last year at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at UCL. And I wanted to just say a couple of things about the uses of neuroscience for poetry as I found them. So I was working with this group called the Speech Communication Lab, which looks at how speech and other forms of verbal communication or vocal communication are produced and processed in the brain. And my interest in this was not really in the kind of language that they were using so much, although that was interesting, but more in the ways in which the sort of the processes, the spaces in particular, and the procedures which they use could be diverted or misused for poetry in some way. How they might suggest new techniques, new processes for poetry, strategies, new forms or ways of making the poems. And what I'm going to do is focus briefly just on two of the things that I found to be particularly interesting. And I'm going to start with playing you a short recording, just 2 minutes long, of me. So there's a sort of phasing sound to the right, strongly my right ear, which is almost like sound. It's almost like a sound, like sounds being kind of thrown onto something metallic. It's very, very quiet, but it's there. It's kind of phasing in and out, and I was getting almost like bird call, which was kind of quite high up against to the right, but quite high up. It was a sort of twittering sound, quite faint, but it was really persistent, like a sort of dawn chorus or something. So that was going on and on. The left-hand side was much kind of duller. It was like a dull pressure, more of a pressure there than there was on the right. So there was kind of more almost like sparkle on the right, whereas the left was just a kind of quite hard pressure. And then I heard my stomach gurgle, and then I started getting Heart of Gold by Neil Young was just kind of playing in my head, and that was kind of annoying, and I couldn't stop it. And I think that's because I remembered I heard it on the radio this morning. It's got quite a whiny voice, and that was just kind of playing through "Looking for a heart of gold" like that, which is irritating. So I made that recording in UCL's anechoic chamber, and for those, maybe people know what an anechoic chamber is, but for people who don't, it's basically it's a box which is insulated from the outside world. So it's floated off its base. It's got these very thick walls and huge amounts of foam padding inside, fiberglass wedges, in fact, which absorb any sound you make. They're both insulated from the outside world and absorb any sound you do make and reflect it, so nothing comes back to you. It's a really, really strange acoustic space, because when you talk, the sound just goes out and it vanishes, like you're standing in the desert or something. And it's one of the quietest places in London, certainly, possibly, and it's one of the quieter places in the world. And I've been sitting there before I made that recording for 20 minutes with no lights on. So you see, I was interested in the kinds of noises that are, either you imagine them or physiological things are happening. So you genuinely experience these kind of things that sound like birds or crackles or and obviously these kind of more psychological things, like you hear just things going around in your head, like Neil Young. And it's used by the speech communication group because it's got a very pragmatic function. They use it to record stimuli which are free from noise. It's just a very kind of, basic thing for them. But it is quite a kind of talismanic site in some ways for anyone who's interested in speech, sound, and composition, because famously John Cage spent time in Harvard's anechoic chamber in the 40s or 50s. He's not quite clear in the details. he supposedly had, I'm sure Peter might say something about John Cage later, maybe not in relation to this, but hearing what he called one high and one low sound, which was apparently his nervous system and the circulation of his blood, as the engineer apparently told him. So Cage drew two lessons from this experience in what you might kind of think of as an oracular space almost. In his lecture Experimental Music, he talks about one thing he's taken from this is that you need to recognise the impossibility of subjective silence. So any living creature carries a kind of fundamental noise with it, just in the fact of its being, its embodiedness. And the second is his demand that a composer should attend to this unintended noise and, as he put it, open the doors of music to the sounds that happen to be in the environment. And so the poetry that I was interested in making out of this experience was also kind of turning to an expanded environment, taking its materials from the accidental music of speech, if you like, which you find, you find it in rhyme or in puns, but also you find it in the melodies of speech, these kind of phatic elements like the and the these apparently inessential elements. And so using this stuff as material, as I did, to make poetry, using that recording as a source text, meant a kind of exercise in creative mishearing, amplifying semantically the kind of small noises that we carry with us, which is, I was quite interested in them because they did seem to be this sort of ambiguous mix of the cultural and the physical, the bodily and the political, kind of shoved into one imaginary sonic space, really. So I'll just briefly say something about another kind of containerization or enclosed space that I became interested in, which is produced by delayed auditory feedback. This is something that's it's used by the speech communication group. Basically, you hear your own voice echoed back to you through headphones with a short delay added, anything between 5 and 200 milliseconds. And as this delay increases, for most people it causes real problems with producing speech. You get flattening of vowels, stuttering, elongating the sounds. And it's used by the speech communication lab, for example, to find areas of the brain which are active in compensating for the delay. And in speech therapy, it can help people who have a stammer, because just like speaking in chorus or other kinds of altered feedback, it can help people to speak. So, but I was interested in the potential that held for poetry as well, because it throws you back onto the surface of language, onto rhythm, prosody, tone, pitch, and timing. These things which are the kind of verbal equivalent of what Georges Perec called the infraordinaire, the infraordinary, that which escapes attention even as it's kind of constituting the texture and the substance of what you're paying attention to. So I'm going to end fairly soon. One of the last things I wanted to just talk about, which comes out of both this idea of the anechoic chamber and delayed auditory feedback, was this idea of bracketing, the idea that you might be able to partially isolate a subject from environmental inputs. And this idea, it seemed to me, was also implied in the scientific method, the idea that the design of scientific experiment, that you might want to isolate whatever you're interested in from other environmental inputs in order to produce, in order to gain your data. So at the moment, one of the pieces that I'm working on is a series of found texts which kind of illuminate this history of enclosed spaces, or what you might think of as scientific vesicles, and trying to explore their qualities and think about what happens when you create this atmosphere by enclosing a space. It might be either noxious or sustaining, but it does create the conditions of possibility for creating certain forms. So I'm just going to end by reading a piece with delayed auditory feedback. If I can find a sheet of paper. It is. So this is from William Derham, who was a kind of fellow of the Royal Society. He was also a theologian, and he wrote this book called Physico-Theology, which has all these kind of footnotes about the experiments that him and his colleagues in the Royal Society were doing. So you should be able to hear the effect, if nothing else. In one of Mr. Hawksby's compressing engines, I closely shut up like a sparrow without forcing any air in. And in less than an hour, the bird began to pant and be concerned. And in less than an hour and a half to be sick, vomit, and more out of breath. And in 2 hours' time was nearly expiring. Another I put in and compressed the air, but the engine leaking, I frequently renewed the compressor, by which means, although the bird panted a little after the first hour, yet after such frequent compressions and emission of fresh air, it was very little concerned, and taking out seemingly unhurt after 3 hours. After this I made two other experiments in compressed air with the weight of 2 atmospheres injected, the engine holding tight and well, the one with the great titmouse, the other with a sparrow. For near an hour they seemed but little concerned, and after that grew fainter, and in 2 hours' time sick, and in 3 hours' time died. Another thing I took notice of was that when the birds were sick and very restless, I fancied they were somewhat relieved for a short space with the motion of the air, caused by their fluttering and shaking their wings, a thing worth trying and diving there.